Welcome to the British Museum's Knowledge Share Spring Event Series 2021. These events seek to build on some of the conversations that were held at our National Programmes Conference in 2019, which explored equality and diversity in UK museum practice. We're delighted to host so many contributors from across the UK's cultural heritage sector, including several returning speakers from our 2019 conference. I'm grateful to the Vivmar Foundation for their long-term and valuable support of the Knowledge Share program, which has made these events possible. And I thank you all for joining us as we explore the ways in which museums and heritage organizations have adapted to the profound changes of 2020 and look ahead to the changes yet to come.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's brilliant to have so many of you here. I'm just going to run through some housekeeping before we can get started. So this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the BM Events YouTube channel afterwards, so you can catch up on anything. But for now, we're filming live and we'd love for you guys to get involved. So the chat function is open. Please do get the conversation going. We want to create a safe environment for discussion and sharing ideas. So please follow the museum's code of conduct, which is protect privacy, please don't share anyone's personal information, stay on topic, and please be respectful. So I'm sure you're looking forward to getting started. So I'm going to hand over to Afzal, who will introduce our brilliant speakers to the stage.
Hello, I'm Afzal Khan and I will be your host for today. Welcome to the final event in the Knowledge Share Spring Event Series. This session is being led by speakers from the National Archives, the Black, African and Asian Therapy Network, and Stillpoint Spaces. They'll be sharing insights into their collaboration, where they've been using therapeutic practice to support the emotionally intense work of addressing histories that relate to racism, colonialism, and empire. Starting the event is Iqbal Singh, the Regional Community Partnerships Manager at the National Archives. His work includes setting up creative partnerships, curating displays, and delivering public history workshops on subjects including the 1919 race riots, Britain during the interwar years, First World War commemorations, and the partition of British India. Iqbal is joined by 4 speakers: Eugene Ellis, an activist, writer, and public speaker on issues of race, difference, and intersectionality. He trained as an integrative arts psychotherapist and is the founder and director of the Black, African, and Asian Therapy Network. Vidya Maharaj is a psychotherapist and an art therapist, a clinical supervisor, group facilitator, and trainer. She is a facilitator in the West Midlands branch of BAATN, supporting experienced and trained practitioners. Dr. Aaron Balik is an author, academic, media consultant, and psychotherapist. He is also the CEO of Stillpoint Spaces, an international hub for the exploration of psychology. Charmaine Pollard is a certified poetry therapist, counselor, author, and life coach. She facilitates therapeutic writing groups in school, colleges, churches, prisons, and in the community. There will be a Q&A at the end, so please do send any questions you have using the Q&A function. I'll come back on screen at the end to present your questions to them. A warm welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. Over to you, Iqbal.
Thank you so much, Afzal and the team at the British Museum. Pre-COVID, there was still much to do to address the histories. Excuse me. I'll just get my slide ready. Pre-COVID, there was still much to do to address histories in relation to racism, colonialism, and empire. The emotionally labor-intensive work that also needs to address both the facts that are uncovered and the feelings it provokes. In light of the overbearing sense of unprecedented change and challenge of recent times, this has become altogether more urgent. Today's presentation shares with you the fruits of a collaboration that we started in 2019 that brings together researchers at the National Archives and psychotherapists at Stillpoint Spaces and the Black, African and Asian Therapy Network, Barton, to kickstart important conversations and psychological processing of this important and challenging material. Could we have the next slide, please? To introduce myself, my name is Iqbal Singh, as Afzal mentioned, and I am part of the outreach team at the National Archives. The National Archives is based in Kew, Richmond, and it is home to the British government's archive. These are documents spanning over 1,000 years of history. They capture some of the key moments in this country's story. Access to the archives is free, and there is also good online access to images and some document collections. As part of the offer at the National Archives, we provide education sessions to children and young people. We also offer an outreach service that aims to engage with adults and community organisations. And Afzal has mentioned some of this, but I'll just say it again a little bit. Outreach have been developing projects with communities for a number of years, with a particular focus on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. These have traditionally been underrepresented in our user figures. In the past, we have run projects such as Caribbean Through a Lens that used images of the Caribbean to engage groups around the country to explore their African Caribbean heritage. More recently, as part of the commemorations for the First World War, we engaged South Asian communities to explore their involvement in this conflict. To mark the 100th anniversary of the 1919 race riots in Britain, in 2019, Outreach led projects in Liverpool and Cardiff to mark this important moment. Still more recently, we have been focusing on projects looking at colonial labour, both during the interwar period, but also tracing these stories further back, including to the use of Indian indentured labour in the 19th century. All our projects are highlighted on our website. So now I'm going to kick off this presentation with a very personal reflection on my experience. And I'm reminded here that I've got 4 therapists on hand because it's quite an emotional thing for me. And it really was when I started this work. So I've got to be deep breathing and be ready for this. So I will kick off this presentation on British India and how this was a catalyst for the collaborations I went on to set up with therapy organisations to look both at Black British history and Indian indentured history, and to explore ways in which these sometimes very emotive and difficult histories could be approached using a format that allowed participants to encounter the fruits of archival research and then work in a therapeutic way to address what the retelling of these histories brought up for the participants. Please give me the next slide. So I joined the National Archives in 2015, and one of the earlier projects I worked on, was commemorating the partition of British India in 1947. Partition refers to the British transfer of power to 2 separate states, India and Pakistan. It included the making of a Muslim homeland by partitioning the provinces of Punjab and Bengal along Muslim and non-Muslim lines. It was this process of partitioning that saw some of the most violent episodes. Working on Partition was an extraordinary first introduction to original archive documents about this momentous moment in world history. And this image is a group from Huddersfield who came to look at some of the documents I had discovered as I followed up various leads. It was at this time quite emotional, reading accounts of death and displacement and processing this too. I also quickly realized how little I actually knew about partition, and also how divided views still are. Why did it happen? How did it happen? And who was to blame? And as I dug deeper, I realized that it was truly a very complex story, maybe most poignantly brought out for me as I started to research how and why so many people were killed. So can we have the next slide, please? This is an image by Bhupinder Singh, also known as Pins, an artist we commissioned as part of Refugee Week 2020 to help us engage audiences further with the story of partition. For the many millions forced to relocate, trains became a potent symbol of the partition experience. Trains provided ideal targets, often overloaded and easy to ambush. Tensions on all sides were increasing as a result of the disaffection with the decision to divide the Punjab. Non-state actors, for example, those allied to political or religious organizations, took it upon themselves to take action. Attacks by one community on another fueled revenge attacks. Partition violence has been referred to as a kind of madness that took people over, but that madness does not do justice to the very systematic and clinical way in which the killing was conducted. Knowledge of train timetables and the collusion of partisan or corrupt officials meant gangs knew when to strike. At the height of the attacks on trains between August and October 1947, the severity of the violence stood out. Former soldiers who had served in the Second World War were able to use their training and their contacts to access arms and carry out attacks. Move to the next slide. Move to our next slide, please. In our archives, we have a number of reports from letters. We have a number of reports and letters from British officials detailing the violence on both sides. One particularly interesting document is a letter from the Deputy High Commissioner in Lahore to the High Commissioner in Karachi, describing the extreme violence that followed the announcement of the dividing line. The document brings to the attention of the High Commissioner the violence that was being witnessed and the sense that nobody quite knew how it had become so devastating. These reports really do bring the horror of what took place. And the lines that can really shake you are, quote, "The sight was extraordinary. On one side was a train from Hindustan, packed with Hindus and Sikhs with hundreds on the roof. On the other was a Muslim train for Pakistan. In the middle was the corpse train. It had been attacked by Muslims some way out and come in an hour before. Clearly the panels had been smashed with stones first. 40 were killed, 70 wounded. The 70 were in a bad order. They had got most of the wounded away in lorries and most of the corpses out. There were about 15 still therein. The train packed to bits, men, women, and children without distinction, just because they were Hindus or Sikhs. The place was a shambles, and the two refugee trains on either side going off like bank holiday crowds. That happened to be a Muslim murder. The same day in Faridkot state, a Muslim train was attacked and the corpses came into Lahore." So can I ask for the next slide, please? Our records are very, very strong on the high politics of partition, on what was happening in terms of the decision-making processes and how they were affecting all sides. However, there aren't the first-hand testimonies of people as an official archive, and it can be rare to have that kind of testimony. But what we do have is something very powerful. Reports from officials who were there on the ground, often providing in very clear and accessible English an insight into the past. But our records do benefit from the memories and reflections and contributions of others. And this image is drawn by my mother, Surjit Hussain, reflecting on how, having left her ancestral home, now in Pakistan, she had the keys of the old property, but no way of accessing it anymore. And as part of Refugee Week 2020, I recorded a short interview with my mother, Surjit, about her memories of leaving home with her family just before partition. I'll ask for the recording to now be played of the interview with me and my mother.
Iqbal recorded a short interview with his mother, Surjit, about her memories of leaving home with her family just before partition.
I mean, my mother and me have had this conversation a number of times in trying to piece together this story of her leaving these ancestral lands. And Rawalpindi was the place where she was last before she actually left what became Pakistan. And she recalls the extraordinary violence that was taking place at the time, with rival gangs often using religious chants to intimidate one another.
All I remember is all the fires and loud shoutings of Allahu Akbar and from Sikhs, Bole Sonyal.
And so in her description, that's something that she recalls very strongly and vividly, and that the fires were burning, and that there's a very unsettled home with people coming in for shelter, trying to look for safety. And I think very much that was the kind of base from which she then starts to tell me her story of leaving, the family scrabbling things together and trying to leave, because they'd been given a heads up.
One of the boss told Payaji that, Raja Singh, you leave now Rawalpindi and take your family to beyond this Firozpur, up to Firozpur.
Her grandfather was quite well connected, and he'd been speaking to some senior people, and they'd said, you need to get out. And so the reason why my family, or my mother's family, left in 1946, at the end of 46, is because I think they could see the writing on the wall, and arrangements were made for them to get out. And that was the journey where they had to then go to Firozpur, which is on the border, literally a border town between the new states. And from there, they then had to regroup, settle themselves for a little while, as arrangements were being made in India, in a place called Dehradun, for them to then go there. And it was a cousin who was helping to sort out this arrangement so that they could settle in their new home. For my mother, I think the main thing was, as a child, coming in as a refugee, speaking Punjabi, which was the language that she had grown up speaking, in an area where Punjabi wasn't spoken. She stood out on a language level. People would make fun of her language. People knew that they were refugees, and that, I think, also added to that sense of just being an outsider.
Babaji had to find a school for us, and schools were all Hindi medium. All I remember that Seth Ram Kishore's sister-in-law, she was giving tuitions to refugees to learn Hindi. So we went to Shanti Benji and we learned Hindi there. But we were in Mahadevi Kanya Pathshala. All I remember, we used to walk from our house to our school, and the main thing I remember is the language. We were totally Punjabi speaking, and there it was all Hindi.
I think for the family itself, I think it was the adjustments that were made. For her father, I think he found the transition very, very difficult. But overall, I think the family did cope, and I think in that sense they were luckier than many others, because arrangements had been made and they were able to settle.
Integrating was harder. You have to be really strong, and that's all I remember.
I think she finds it still very difficult to speak about. And I think she herself says that she doesn't remember that much detail. And I think some of that, from having spoken to her a number of times, is part of her just wanting to forget. It's not something that she necessarily wants to remember in too much detail. It's difficult, Matt, because I think the thing is for her, it's still an uncomfortable conversation. And that may be, similar to many others who have experienced that kind of refugee experience, where they hold on to a few things. But sometimes she will tell me some of the details of, there was a flooding in Firozpur, obviously things had become a lot more dramatic. And arriving in Dehradun, I think, that sense that the status that they had before, they were from a reasonably well-off family. The grandfather was a civil surgeon. He was a medical doctor. But he and his family and my mother, they all did struggle. So this was the point about partition. It didn't, in that sense, have any discrimination. Everyone was affected and everyone felt shaken by the experience. But as this document that I've shared shows, for some, the experience was far, far more horrific. Partition has been referred to as a kind of madness that took people over. But madness does not do justice to the very systematic and clinical way in which the killing was conducted. Partition was the seeking of refuge in the face of violence or the impending threat of violence. It was people literally fleeing for their lives to seek out relative safety. It's a stark reminder that people do not leave their homes unless there is something genuinely that they are afraid of. The partition of British India and the resulting refugee story is a story of people finding safety and trying to remake their lives, often in the face of great adversity. For the over 3 million people of South Asian heritage in this country, partition can still have very personal relevance. It is a story. It is a story that still impacts many of them, both in seen and unseen ways. I can say this more naturally if you want.
You're on mute, Iqbal. Iqbal, you're on mute.
I'm back on, sorry. So I just wanted to say that it's interesting in hearing that recording, and I've played it a little bit longer just to show how the voice breaks at this particular moment of remembering these conversations with my mother and the intensity. So I try to cover up that emotion by saying I can say it more naturally. And maybe that is something that I can't really do. Somewhere that difficulty that I say my mother feels in speaking about partition has maybe been inherited. In 2012-13, I did a course on psychotherapy, and it was very intense and opened me up a lot to many things. One of the last exercises I did was to write an essay that helped me to reflect on the course as a whole and what I saw as my next steps. And one of the more powerful reflections for me was to research further my unfinished story of partition. So when I confronted feelings at seeing records at the National Archives that I found emotionally moving, I returned to my experience of therapy to try and understand and process what was going on. And this in turn led me to seek out the collaborations that you see before you today. So can I ask for the next slide? So to my first collaboration with Stillpoint Spaces. This pilot project was born out of a workshop in June 2019. A group of people from diverse personal and professional backgrounds came together to look at the themes of race and racism. As part of the day, participants broke up into smaller groups. One of the subgroups I took part in looked at how archives, education, and public engagement could address the themes of the day. In response to this, I developed a collaboration with Stillpoint Spaces and the poetry therapist Charmaine Pollard, a program of workshops under the heading of Racism Past and Present. One of the aims of the workshop series was to offer to tell the long story of the Black community in Britain, from the end of the First World War through to the early 70s. Before carrying on further, I'm really happy to be able to hand over to Aaron Ballick, Director of Stillpoint Spaces, to say some words. Over to you, Aaron.
Thank you so much for that, Iqbal, and thank you for sharing that particularly vulnerable part at the end. And I think this is pretty much what we've been about. You share personal information and you share historical fact, and that comes with a lot of baggage that often goes unaddressed. And baggage, I mean, the emotions and the feelings that come with that. Just a little bit of background about Stillpoint Spaces. We started as a community of international psychotherapists who wanted to explore how we could bring the skills that psychotherapy brings to bear in the consulting room outside of the consulting room. And we used to run a series of events called Psychoanalysis in the Streets, where we would invite members of the public to come to discuss important contemporary issues that were maybe difficult to have conversations about. And they could be about sexuality, they could be about gender, they could be about money or politics. And we sort of developed into a grouping of therapists in what we call the psychologically curious, how therapists could apply psychological thinking to a bigger public who didn't have to come to a therapist consulting room to have that experience. It's a different experience in the consulting room, but we really wanted to think creatively about how we can share that insight outside the consulting room. And this is where our two paths started to meet. In 2019, our team decided that we wanted to commit a year to looking at race and racism in contemporary Britain, and really integrate that into our event schedule for the psychologically curious. And if you can pass on to the next slide, please. This was kind of a long and labored discussion about how to do this, because though we were curious therapists who wanted to work, we're committed to anti-racism and we're committed to social justice, many of us were white. We had feedback that our space was quite white and that people who weren't white felt that there. We wanted to remedy the situation and we weren't quite sure how. And so it was a bit of an experiment for us. And so we decided to just have a free open day and invite the public to come and help us do that, that we would facilitate the psychological space, that we would commit to working with individuals who had the expertise that we could deliver over the next year. And then the next conversations were how are we able to do this? We made a communication to the public. I believe Iqbal saw that invitation and came to that day, which he was describing before, which I'm just so pleased about. So it's kind of an acknowledgement that our expertise lay in the facilitation of psychological events, but we had a lack of expertise in the specific issues of race and racism. We wanted to invite that in and then make it happen. And then we wanted to take that experience to build partnerships with stakeholders in the community so we could carry on doing that. And I'm really happy to say that it's way past 2019 and we are still committed to doing that. And we have a lot of those community relationships now to keep rolling that forward. Again, it was experimental, and I'm glad to say that it mostly worked. And I think what mostly worked about it is an acknowledgement that people learn in different ways and different styles. So the way we structured that day is we had large group experiences, we had small group experiences, we had people engaging with objects, plasticine, painting, writing. We had a microphone set up in one of the consulting rooms so people could leave voice messages, write notes to each other, comment. And then we would come together at various points during the day and collect the major themes that arose. And then we used our consulting rooms downstairs to have a collection of people addressing each of those themes so that they could work out if these themes were actually addressed and worked with, could they have an impact, and how could they have an impact? Because we really wanted to do something with the information that was arising from that day. And then the day finished off with everybody coming upstairs, presenting from their small groups, us capturing those small groups, creating a mailing list, and then writing to those stakeholders and inviting them back. And three of those stakeholders are there actually, because our video was with us as well that day. And we worked very closely with Iqbal and Charmaine to create similar experiences, big groups, small groups, with opening up access to that experience through educational learning and psychotherapy by way of poetry and writing. And we're going to hear more about that from Charmaine next. But that's pretty much the model that I wanted to share with you, with a great deal of gratefulness for all of those people who responded and enabled us to make that happen. And I would pass it back to you, Iqbal.
Thank you very much. Right. So thank you, Aaron, for that. And so the aim now is to offer you an insight into the approach we developed with a short participative activity. I will start with a short introduction to a document, and that's how we did it when we started this project with Stillpoint, a short introduction to a document. We will be sharing that from our collection. It will then be followed by an exercise led by Charmaine Pollard, again, just following the same technique that will include the use of a breakout room. In this instance, it was an opportunity for us to obviously talk in the room. And then there'll be a writing activity and a chance for you to feedback via the chat facility. Simon, is it possible to have the James Gillespie letter up again? Sorry. Yeah, thank you. So this is what we're going to take you through. So the 1919 race riots were one of the most serious outbreaks of violence after the war and brought to national attention the presence of Black communities in Britain. The causes of the rioting were many and varied and differed from location to location and community to community. Ostensibly, they arose out of anger at the presence of Black and Arab men who were seen to be taking jobs and housing from white British men and forming relationships with white women. As a result of the rioting, the government placed further emphasis on a policy of repatriating men back to the colonies. Two major centres of outbreak of the violence were Cardiff and Liverpool. Elsewhere in Wales, there was trouble, including in Barry, when a fish and chip shop run by James Gillespie and his white wife was destroyed in violence conducted against what was seen then as foreign men. And we meet James Gillespie when he pops up in our Colonial Office records with the letter that you can see on the screen after his business is destroyed. And he addresses it to the then Prime Minister, no less, David Lloyd George. Like other Black men, James Gillespie had sought out work on board merchant shipping and was following in a much longer and older line of Black sailors and seamen who had served Britain on the seas, including in the First World War. Having worked on the seas for almost 20 years, James Gillespie had decided to take up work onshore and eventually settled in Barry, opening a fish and chip shop. Men from the Caribbean and Yemen were allowed to work from British ports as they were part of the British Empire. So when the riots broke out and he was confronted with the loss of his livelihood and a policy of repatriating Black men to the Caribbean, he faced an enormous dilemma. The policy of repatriation introduced by the British government in 1919 offered men from colonies like Jamaica, where James Gillespie originally came from, a small allowance to cover expenses and the journey. At the same time, the policy was quickly adjusted to forbid white wives of Black men from returning with them to the Caribbean. James Gillespie and his white wife would not have found living in Wales easy and would have been through a lot already as a couple. Press reporting of mixed marriages was very negative, and one of the catalysts for the rioting in Cardiff was a group of Black men returning from a trip with white women. It's against this backdrop that James Gillespie wrote the letter to Prime Minister, this wanting to keep his family together. And you get a sense from the letter that he was very much in love with his wife and that he wanted her to still be very much part of his life. It is likely him and his wife would have found the whole thing terribly upsetting. Gillespie's anguish can be traced in the letter. At one point, he says he will leave without compensation because things have become so serious, but then goes on to say he is in financial ruin and that he may not be able to be the breadwinner he wants to be, and that in returning to Jamaica, he does not want to be a burden on the colony. His story gives the impression that he has been a hardworking man who, even after finishing his work aboard ships, had found the energy to start up a small business with his wife. But it is the way he ends his letter that is maybe the most poignant and meaningful part. It touches your heart and may have moved the officials at the Colonial Office too, when he refers to being a loyal son of empire, even if, as he says, his color is black. And this would have been something other men from the Caribbean would have claimed. People in the Caribbean had been schooled from their early years into believing they were part of the empire and that Britain was the mother country. And you may get his sense of disappointment or even betrayal that having served the empire and tried his best to make a life here, he deserved something more. He says he is willing to return to Jamaica, but is very concerned that the compensation on offer will not be enough, and he does not want to return without his wife and family. So please now may I pass on to Charmaine, who will take us through an exercise and allow us to listen to the letter.
Okay, thank you for that, Iqbal, and welcome to everybody. You're about to hear a recording of the letter that Gillespie wrote to the then Prime Minister, Lord George. As you hear the letter, I'm just going to give you some instructions just to think about. So just pay attention as you're listening to the letter of any of your reactions, your gut reactions, any emotional responses, maybe where in your body that you locate any of those feelings, anything that maybe stands out or is striking in some way, or anything that you don't like. So just pay attention to your responses and reactions. So if you could please play the letter now.
Honored Sir, pardon me for taking up a few seconds of your precious time regarding my humble letter. Sir, I am a native of Jamaica, British West Indies. Been a seaman by profession, sailing out of the port of Barradock from since 1896 till 1917 when I stopped to go into government work from the 29th of September 1917 to the 1st of June 1918. The work was finished, granaries. I started a little business in the refreshment department, fish fryers, until the last racial riot, 12th of June 1919, when my home was destroyed by the rioters. I applied for repatriation for myself and my family several times to the Home Office, Colonial Office, and the West Indian Committee. I filled a form in likewise a letter from my creditors giving me permission to leave the country. It's 4 months since I applied for aid to left the country. I received a letter on the 21st instance informing me that I refused this offer unless certain concessions were made. The interpretation of the application is I am willing to leave the country at once with my wife and child, not without any compensation, although I am ruined in monetary matters to the amount of £227. I have to sacrifice what little I have left in furniture with a 26 shillings a week out of work donation to keep the wolf from the door. I am begging, honored sir, as leader of the British Empire, to give me and my family passage to Jamaica. I am not asking, sir, for any compensation. Would pay my own fare if I was in a position to do so, but what little I have is just enough to start with in Jamaica. I don't want to take my family out there to be a burden on the country. Trusting, sir, you will take compassion on one of Britain's son, even if his color is black. I remain, sire, your humble servant, James Gillespie.
So thank you for just listening to the letter. I imagine it would have brought up some feelings or emotions, or you'll have some thoughts around that. So what I'm going to invite you to do next is to maybe share your thoughts and feelings in a breakout room. And then afterwards, we'll come back and we'll do a writing exercise. So do get your pens and paper ready. And before we go into the breakout rooms, it'd be great if you could just put your camera on, just so that we can, speak to each other and just talk about what's come up for us. So we're going to be in the breakout rooms for about 6 minutes. So Georgia, if you could just open the breakout rooms. And if people could just press the join button and talk about your thoughts and feelings in response to hearing the letter. And if you could just pop what you've written in the chat. So what you've noticed, you just pop that in the chat. Okay, and I'll just read a couple of them. So I notice empathy and an effort to understand and support. I notice hope, pessimism, and pessimism intertwined. Okay, how sad you feel. So yeah, it really does bring up all sorts of feelings, but sadness is certainly one of them. And again, deep sadness for this situation. And somebody's wrote that they want to reassure him. And yeah, and certainly when we've done this exercise before, it's a reminder that racism and it still exists. So again, it feels like the sadness seems to be coming up a lot and feeling hopeless. And somebody's written they're deeply moved and affected by the story and desire to help and keen to know what happened to him and his family. Yeah, that is something that certainly came up last time as well. Really wanted to know what happened. I guess wanted to know whether or not there was a happy ending to that story. Yeah. So I guess I just want to thank you all really just for taking the risk and joining in with this exercise. It was just great just to read some of the responses, and unfortunately I can't listen to all of them. But because it sort of brought up some difficulties, and I'm sure even some of the things that you heard from what Iqbal had mentioned, and sure when Vidya comes on again, memories will be stirred up. Really think about what you might do just to look after yourself. Okay, thank you. Just going to pass back to Iqbal now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Charmaine, for that. And I think this goes to the heart of what we're doing, this interrogating of the feeling, that the feeling is okay. And have we got the slide up now for James Gillespie, Simon? That's up, I think. Yes, you can see it. So in interrogating the feeling, we're also, and I know this is going to come up for people, what else can we find out about James? What other information? And this is something that I'm really excited to be able to share with you, because I've got the permission just literally, a couple of days ago, and we have confirmed actually it's a record that we have. It's amazing what you can find in archives. And so before we move on, I just want to share this small, wonderful surprise that my colleague, I should say, Catherine Collins, Education Officer at the National Archives, helped locate. This, we believe, is an image of James Gillespie from a registry card of merchant seaman. Apart from the photo, which is priceless, we have some more details, including his month and year of birth, August 1874, and place of birth, Jamaica, British West Indies. We also have his nationality, British, his father's nationality is also given as British. His rating or job on board ship is given as bosun, a ship's officer responsible for maintenance of the ship and its equipment. So it's this kind of deep diving, not only into our emotions and acknowledging them, but also doing more diving into the records, finding out more details, really, really important. Can I ask us to have the next slide? I realize that time is going at such a speed. So this is our second collaboration with Barton, and I'm obviously very conscious of time, and I do really want us to have a chance to also do the exercise with Vidya, but I'll try and canter through this. So this drew on an emerging interest in the story of Indian indentured labour. The collaboration was with Barton, which took the form of an online workshop called Trauma Resilience Recovery. It briefly introduced the audience to different interpretations of this history from 4 historians, and then turned to 4 case studies based on archival documents. These were chosen again to offer the long view, to give insights into the different periods and aspects of this story from the early days of indenture to its eventual ending. The presentation from the National Archives was followed by a presentation from Barton member Vidya Maharaj, who presented the inside experience of those who made the journey and how indentureship lives and expresses itself in her current life and family as well. The workshop ended with a Q&A and a chance for people to share reflections. Barton subsequently and very kindly created a legacy page, which included a space to answer some of the more challenging questions which were raised by the workshop, plus copies of archival documents that were used in the presentation were uploaded, and a space was provided for people to leave further comments. Before continuing, I'd really like to hand over to Eugene Ellis, founder and director of Barton, for an introduction to the work of the organization. Over to you, Eugene.
Thank you, Iqbal. And yeah, I was just really feeling, people wholeheartedly taking part, and thank you for that. I'm going to say something about Barton and then something about our association with the National Archive and the Indian Indenture Project as a whole. So just to say something about us, Barton is the Black, African and Asian Therapy Network. We're a network of therapists who support each other. We support our healing, our internal wounds. We try to bring life to the stories of our communities, the historical, the present day, and bring those stories out into the public domain. And Barton is about attending to the overall thing is about Barton attending to the psychological consequences of the relationship between Africans, South Asians, Caribbeans, and the British as a consequence of empire and colonialism. We're also about supporting each other, supporting people from these communities also to become counsellors and psychotherapists, and encouraging that, and encouraging people from these communities to attend to their mental health. We also have a directory, 600 people there at the moment, almost 600, and who have declared that they can work and they feel confident in working with these issues with clients and therapists. Can we show the next slide? Another part of Barton's remit is to give accessible information to the public. So we have blogs, blog posts, a knowledge base with lots of articles, podcasts, videos, all really from a UK perspective. There's a lot of information from America about lots of these issues, but this is quite unique in that it's from a sort of UK perspective. And so the information is there for our communities, but it's also for anyone who wants to understand and gain some insight and to think about things. So please feel free. There's a lot of resources built up over the years on our website. I just want to go back to the first slide, just to sort of give context to Barton's association with the National Archives. It's been really important for us. We're an association, as I said, of African, South Asian and Caribbean people, and migration from India into the Caribbean and Africa is an important context for our membership. Important for us to reflect on that and to come to terms with the impact of that on future generations and us in the present. These groups came together through shared experience of severe hardship, which brought with it a kind of kinship, I guess, and that's partly why, I guess, the grouping is as it is in Barton, but it also brought about the types of conflict that come about through forced and voluntary migration, the difficulties. And some of those difficulties still live on. It's important to state that the trauma of the indenture experience still lives on. And when I say trauma, there's something about the simplest form, there's something in us, in our bodies, that just seems to play itself out. Has a life of its own. We feel unable to control or have access to it. So conversations of indentureship need to take place. So we certainly, as a community at Barton, but also in the wider British public, can begin to have access to how trauma lives on in us and how we might be able to possibly heal. I'm just going to go on to the next slide, a slide after that. Thank you. I just want to finish off by stating something that seems really obvious, and I guess it's what we're doing now, in some ways having the race conversation here, and how important that is in terms of bringing bringing us together to think through these issues. This is a book I wrote it was published a few months ago. So the book is really about the reality of having these types of conversations, kind of conversations we need to have on Indian indenture, on partition, on empire and colonialism, and how uncomfortable they are. They're really, really uncomfortable. And so I wanted to write something which kind of gave some context to the conversation, but also gave us a bit of a clue, a bit of a roadmap, I guess, about how we might resource ourselves so that we stay with the conversation, which is, as you say, is very tough sometimes and very emotional, as we've seen this afternoon. So that's kind of all I wanted to say about Barton and our association with the National Archives. So I'm just going to hand over back to Iqbal.
Thank you so much, Eugene. That's so kind of you. And I'm going to carry on. So for the purposes of today's presentation, and to move us on, I will first provide a brief statement from the National Archives to introduce Indian indenture. Under colonial rule, India's population provided the British Empire with a ready source of cheap labour and mobile labour. Many Indians became indentured labourers to escape the widespread poverty and famine in the 19th century. Some travelled alone, others brought their families to settle in the colonies they worked in. The demand for Indian indentured labourers increased dramatically after the abolition of slavery. They were sent, sometimes in larger numbers, to plantation colonies, producing high-value crops such as sugar in Africa and the Caribbean. Indians travelled to many places to work as indentured labour, and depending on the destinations, indentures started at different times. But I would also like to add that at the heart of this story are lived people's experiences. There are many difficult and upsetting episodes, and introducing this topic, we are conscious of this. And in doing this presentation, we also recognise that there is still much debate about Indian indenture and still a lot more research to be done. We also recognise that in our records, there may be terms used in historical ways that reflect attitudes and language at the time that are now considered derogatory or offensive. As I mentioned in my introduction to our collaboration with Barton, we held an online workshop in October 2020. A key element of the feedback was a request for people to be given more time to hear from one another and to reflect on the experience of indenture. So later this year, on the 24th of July, we'll be running a whole day workshop online hosted by Barton. So please keep a lookout for this. We will have proper breakout groups, as it were, exploring topics relating to indenture in a lot more detail. And today we can give you a very, very brief introduction into what we are planning with the workshop that me, Vidya and Eugene have been devising that will offer you a chance to experience how we are starting to plan to take this collaboration forward. And so before I continue any further, I'd like to invite Vidya to say something more about the Indian indenture experience from a more personal perspective. And then I will add a little detail from the historical sources before Vidya leads us in a short exercise with an archival document. So can I hand over to Vidya, please?
Thank you, Iqbal. Okay, so just a little quick disclaimer before I start. I will at points be talking in what I call a Trinidadian English accent. It is not an authentic Trinidadian accent. It's more a kind of thing that the global diaspora do, where they bant around in their own accents that sound nothing like their homeland accents. I'm using it just to sort of get across a bit of context, but I want to apologise to any of the Trinidadians in the audience who recognise it to be completely just a personal kind of non-Trinidadian accent. Okay, so there are many stories that I could tell you about my Indo-Trinidadian ancestors, stories that portray experienced trauma, their resilience, their resistance, and their determination to strive for their dreams into a kind of recovery, albeit riddled with a trauma outcome. Here are just a tiny, tiny few. So on my maternal side, my aunt tells me about my great-grandfather. She says, they send your mother-grandfather back. He left his son and his wife with a cedar. They sent him back because he was a rebel. They want no troublemakers. He was protesting pay and conditions, so they cut his contract and they put him back on the boat. My maternal grandfather was an indentured Indian. He had managed to save enough money to buy himself a plot of land. So my cousin tells me he set up his own cocoa estate and he made a good living out of it. But then the British want to dig for oil. This ruined his land because it changed the quality of the soil. So now you couldn't grow nothing on the land. So your father's family remained poor. He did manage to build a house on the hill there. It made of wood. It just about still standing. Here make enough to build a brick house after they dig for oil. My grandmother was born in Trinidad. She had a tattoo on her hand. It is an Indian belief that traveled the seas with her, a tradition of her ancestors. She believed that without this tattoo, people could not drink water or eat food from her hands. The lack of indenture narratives in the UK opens up a space in which we, the Indian indentured descendants, can be mischaracterized and often remain unrepresented. For me, this has always created a fatigued frustration and a need to self-protect, a kind of unsafety, particularly when issues of race and identity are being discussed, be that socially or professionally. I did not know anything about indenture growing up here in the UK, but I did know to say that I was from Trinidad, not India, not Pakistan, not Asia. In my 20s, I still did not know. In fact, it was not until my 30s that I learned about the British Empire's post-slavery system. My parents and my extended family members have always been proud Trinidadians. Whilst my cousins had been taught about empire and Indian indenture in school in Trinidad, I had not here in the UK. Imagine what that creates for indentured descendants across the globe. I'm going to hand you back to Iqbal.
Thank you, Vidya. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to really quickly just say something now because I realize the time and I really do want to give Vidya and us a bit of time just to do the exercise. So people left India for many reasons, personal family reasons, middlemen who made an offer of work. The labor was very, very tough. People were allotted to an employer without any choice. It was very long hours and laborers lived in small rooms. Women were often the subject of abuse and exploitation in particular, and the shortage of food and lodgings, laborers paid for food and lodgings, and life was very, very hard. What I'd like to do, rather than carry on with that detail, is to pass over in a minute to Vidya, but I just want to end with a reflection by the historian Bridge Lal, who's done some amazing work in this area, and whose own grandfather was an indentured laborer in Fiji. And he reminds us that while indenture was exploitative, it also allowed new opportunities. And Bridge Lal has also reflected on the overall experience of indenture as one of displacement, of feeling that you do not belong anywhere, not in India, not in the colony you were taken to. I'd just like to now hand over to Vidya so she can take us through the exercise and we can look at the photo that you can see shortly that will be put on.
Okay, before we do that, I'm just going to talk about a common experience. It's a common experience for anyone that's from another country, really, or whose ancestors are from another country. The question, where are you from? A relatively harmless question. But where do I belong? I see myself as British Indo-Trinidadian, but I often describe myself as British, Indo-Caribbean, Asian from Trinidad. I don't really see myself as Asian. My Trinidadian relatives see me as English. The English see me as Asian, and the Asian see me as different from them, but usually ending their question with, but you're Indian, right? Erasing my whole Indo-Caribbean history and experience. Gayatri Bahadur, author of Coolie Woman, states that we begin in the sea, discussing a sense of belonging neither here nor there, something I strongly identify with. In fact, my mother's grandfather was born on a boat bringing labourers to Trinidad. It is as if all this time I've been looking at myself in the battlefield of double consciousness through the eyes of others who do not hear me and see me, who do not know about this history, as I didn't myself, and who are not interested to listen because it doesn't fit with the narratives of race discourse in the UK. In that process, I have dismissed the origins of my Indian ancestors, whilst at the same time being a continuation of them. There sits a double bind within me, the rejection of all things Indian, because I am from Trinidad, the place of my relatives, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and so on, where we have knowledge of our Indo-Caribbean ancestors. And in this double bind, there too rests the knowledge that in my Indo-Carib culture sits a chutney mix of India and our newly formed and handed down Indo-Caribbean culture, our Indo-Trini culture. So could we possibly bring up the photograph now? Yeah, so what I'm going to ask you to do again with this photograph, continuing in Charmaine style, is to really just stay with your feelings, really just drop into your body, your chest and your stomach, and notice what comes up. I'd like you to just take a look at the photograph. At first glance, what kind of feelings are generated within you? Notice the people. Who do we think these people are? What do we imagine that these people are feeling? Notice anyone in any kind of different style of dress. Notice the women, the children, the men. Pick out any details that you can see. Please bring your attention to your feelings and what is stirring within you. Naturally, you'll be having many thoughts. Please notice the feelings attached to those thoughts. What roles do we think these people might have had? What might they have left behind? What might they be looking forward to? If they were right here in the room with you, who might they be? Acknowledge your feelings of having them around you. We're now just going to, I think I'm not going to throw people into breakout rooms actually. I'm just going to ask you to type your feelings into the chat box here. Anything that came up for you at all? Sadness, loss, sorrow, feeling heavy. So much feeling. Thank you, Teresa. Sadness. Support staff, or a memory of support staff at a school in East Africa. Hopelessness. A sort of helplessness. Courage. Afraid, unknown, worry for their poverty, their bare feet and their safety. Unanswered questions, confusions, curiosity. I want to know their stories. They're so unforgotten. The white gaze. It's important that we acknowledge as well that in the experience of everything that they may have left behind, some people that they may have lost, and some things that they may have brought with them. You know, they brought a lot of things with them. They brought food, they brought their culture, their traditions, their religions, their belief systems. They also brought with them their resilience. They brought dreams and hopes. Their history and what they lost, the impact of immigration, sadness, a sense of hopelessness and despair. Each person is an individual connected within families, their own stories, desires and hope, but all reduced by their powerlessness in the face of aggressive, diminishing machine of colonialism. Okay. I'm just going to, we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to say thank you all for engaging in that practice. And if you have any questions that you'd like to address to us, please do pop them in the chat box.
Thank you, Vidya. Thank you so much. I'll just literally end, and so that we can have a little bit of time for Q&A, but just really to say that I hope that everyone has got a sense of what we're trying to do. It doesn't do justice to the amazing work that therapists do and how these projects have developed, but hopefully it'll just give you a flavor of the importance of being aware of your feelings. I certainly would have loved that when I was working initially on my Partition records. I suddenly started to cry, I would well up, I would get very, very upset. And having some kind of therapeutic support to just be aware of those emotions, to breathe into your body, to really, really give yourself time and space, and don't feel that you're being a little boy or somebody who's just that you give yourself that space. And I think that's been the richness of being given this opportunity to work with such wonderful therapists and really be reminded again. I think we just constantly be reminded of that. So the aim throughout this work has been to explore ways in which these sometimes very emotive and difficult histories can be approached using a format that allows participants to encounter the fruits of archival research and then work in a therapeutic way to address what the retelling of these histories brought up in the participants. Designing spaces that allow the processing of emotions is an important first challenge. These same emotions can then drive the search for answers. And certainly in my instance, I've really researched far more into Partition and understood it's a much longer, much more complex story. It doesn't necessarily take away the emotion and the horror of some of what happened, but it gives you something more. And similarly with your emotional work, you can do that. For example, through further historical and archival research, as I've said, the presentation has sought to draw out some of the stages that are necessary to become aware or present to feelings we may have that, if not handled carefully, can distort our view of what happened and our ability to ultimately interpret the past in a way that does justice to the story. So I'd just like to thank everyone for being part of this. I think we've got a few minutes really for questions, but thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to everyone for an awesome session. We have one question so far. Can you offer any tips for handling any difficult emotions arising from the content of this session?
I mean, I would say just acknowledge that that's where you are, and just look after yourself during the course of the coming days. Do what you need to do for self-care. And, this is stirring stuff. When we think about history and we think about what we know and what we don't know and stuff, it is very stirring. So yeah, just put yourself first.
I would say seek someone out. So maybe someone that you know. I mean, they would love to talk about this, probably. Someone you trust, because it's hard work and it's really hard to do it on your own. So I would suggest finding someone if it feels like you need to.
Anything else, Iqbal, Aaron, Charmaine, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I certainly agree with finding somebody that whose company you enjoy and just sharing with them. I think it's really important to talk. I mean, I've got some great friends back in Manchester who, whenever difficult things come up for me, they're the go-to people because they listen and they really validate what I'm experiencing.
We have a question for Iqbal. Can you please remind us of the date of the July webinar you mentioned and how we can register?
It's 24th of July. We're going to be advertising it via Eventbrite. I think that's correct. So really just keep an eye out. It will have a title of indenture in it. So that at the moment is where it's going to be. So please do keep a lookout. Aaron, were you going to say anything? Sorry, about the question about handling this?
Yeah, I was just going to echo what all the other shrinks in the room said, but also just say that, it's difficult material and that difficult material makes us feel bad. So in a sense, it's just kind of normalizing that, in a way saying thank you for coming and thank you for subjecting yourself to material that you could anticipate was going to make you feel bad, and to accept those bad feelings. And that's all part of learning through this process and integrating that process. And I know it sucks, and this is kind of often what we say in the consulting room, like it sucks to feel this way, but they're your feelings. Embrace them, let them be, don't be afraid of it. And like everybody else said, share them, talk to people that you're close to. I'm sure Charmaine would agree, write them down if you need to, or put them into artwork, all that stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's exceptional advice. And I mean, I certainly for the National Archives, something that we've done before with colleagues here, that when we've looked at some of the records that are very moving, and I think this is something going forward that we'd like to do even more, is that hopefully with lockdown coming down, that when people can come and see the records, the idea of having a therapist on hand or advising or designing the work with therapists present. So we're really thinking about the emotion that records bring up. It's not just a historical sort of distant thing that you do where you kind of just look at records and then you kind of gather facts and that's it. These facts have impacts. They're not something that we can just lose sight of in that way. So that, I think, has been the main sort of work that we're really now starting. And I'm so, happy that we're doing the work. The Barton workshop is happening on the 24th of July, a real chance to do more justice to this very important story of Indian indenture, with a whole day, giving people real time to spend and talk and really look at the journey, the arrival, and the departure. And I'm hoping also with Stillpoint and others that we can do more work on some of the work we've just started, really doing some of the deep dive. And this autumn, we're hoping to have a play that we've commissioned on interracial marriages, really inspired by some of the material that we have, the James Gillespie story and some other stories. So that will be something to watch for, which I'm hoping that we'll be able to launch in Black History Month and really give people an opportunity to come in and look and hear some of these fascinating stories that we have, particularly from the 1920s, when lots of things were happening in this country, and I think will be really important for people to sort of get a chance to hear about.
Where will that be? Sorry.
End of October. We haven't fixed the date, but it'll be hopefully the last week of October for an audio play that's already been commissioned. So we're looking for a half-hour play on our records, looking at interracial marriage, and really hoping that all people will be able to come to that as well.
Yeah, thank you. We have 2 minutes left, and if you can answer this question as quickly as you can, is someone has asked, I'm doing research on the mixed race experience as a psychotherapist, and I'm finding myself disassociating a lot with the content. Are there any tips you have on how to immerse yourself in the race discourse while still staying present? That's a big question, I know, but any quick answers to that?
I mean, my immediate thought is that Barton has an each one teach one each one teach one project, which is basically mentors, experienced therapists within Barton who mentor trainees through their education really as a counsellor. And it's a supportive space because there's a lot of trauma that comes up, not just in what you're writing about, but also in being a Black or Asian therapist or a mixed race therapist. Within Barton, we also have a mixed race group, a gathering of mixed race practitioners that tends to happen how often, Eugene?
It's maybe monthly or six weekly. It's a multiracial group. I mean, that's for therapists, I guess, but so this research, I'm not sure if they're a therapist or not, but I mean, if they're not, I would suggest putting out a call actually to other people who you feel would benefit from this group, because I mean this multi-heritage group has just gone mad. You know, it's so needed. It's so desperate. People are just desperate, and people are in their little silos and on their own, and it just feels really important to come together in some way and to support each other in a sort of affinity group kind of way. I think that's really important.
Sadly, that's all we have time for. We just run out of time, but thank you very much for a brilliant session, a very pertinent session. This is sadly the last session for the Knowledge Share experience, and we thank you for joining us if you joined us for the last 10 sessions. They will be uploaded on YouTube very soon, and some of them already have been. So if you haven't had the chance to watch them, you can go onto YouTube, the British Museum YouTube channel and catch up. And so yeah, that's a goodbye from me. Thank you very much.